Through the clouds of dust from another airstrike, this much is clear. The city of Aleppo is under a bombardment of unimaginable violence. The attacks are daily, though this one was filmed last week. People here say barrel bombs were dropped from Syrian helicopters. And that may well be true, given how expert the survivors have become in the military tactics used to wipe them out. Then the bulldozers move in, though not to clear the rubble. Instead, they are sifting through it, because that's the only way to find the dead, lying beneath the concrete. A cupboard of clothes neatly lined up is teetering on the edge of the bomb site, along with those who managed to live here. Some 300,000 people still in rebel-held areas, almost completely surrounded now, and on the brink of what the UN this week called a medieval and shameful siege.
Despite the siege of Aleppo, the warplanes and helicopters never left the skies. This is Al-Mashhad district. It was hit by 2 barrel bombs, which killed 20 people. We recovered 6 bodies, and we're looking for another 8.
The Syrian army is now using drones to film its advance here, as well as the destruction below. Aleppo, or what is left of it, is potentially the biggest prize in 5 years of civil war. My soul, my blood, I give myself for Syria, the soldiers shout. The army released these pictures today, showing newly captured areas in the north of the city. Despite the celebrations, aid agencies say those trapped inside face possible starvation, with food supplies due to run out in 2 to 3 weeks' time.
The city is de facto besieged because it is almost militarily completely encircled. The clock is therefore ticking. There is no doubt about that.
Most of Aleppo is surrounded by Syrian government forces, with Shia militiamen from Lebanon, Iraq and Iran. The most recent bombardment, aided by the Russians, has been concentrated in the north. In the last few days, the Bala-Ramoun roundabout there and the Castello Ring Road have been captured. This cuts off the last supply road out to the Turkish border, leaving rebel forces even more confined in the east of the city. These are army pictures of the Bala-Ramoun roundabout, and today it's advanced beyond it into the suburbs. Any chance of a ceasefire here depends on the Russians talking to the Americans in Geneva, but how fast will the Russians move when victory appears near? The Syrian government has dropped these leaflets on the city, calling on civilians to cross into government-controlled areas, telling them to hold the leaflet above their heads, presumably to avoid being shot. Russia's defence minister today talked of a large-scale humanitarian operation, with 3 safe corridors out and rebels offered the chance to surrender. But without the UN guaranteeing their safety, how many of these battle-hardened people will leave now, having stayed on the rebel side so long? Yet the alternative of staying is no alternative. At the weekend, 4 hospitals were bombed from the air. While these babies in incubators survived, the nurses say that one did not. Last week, this man was filmed in eastern Aleppo, crying over the body of his wife in the back of a truck and asking for his dead son to be brought to him. The suffering of Aleppo, then, filmed by those who live it every appalling day.
And Jonathan Rugman joins me now. Jonathan, Aleppo has seen so many terrible moments over the last few years. How is this different? Is this different?
Well, it could spell the beginning of the end of the Syrian revolution as we knew it 5 years ago, because Aleppo is Syria's biggest city. If it falls, maybe the revolution will fail as well. And aside from the humanitarian crisis unfolding there, what you could end up with in Syria is a division between the Assad government and the far more extreme Islamist groups such as Islamic State, which of course is what the Syrians and the Russians want.
Now, just before we came on air, the UN issued a new statement. What did it say?
They are extremely worried
about this humanitarian crisis. They welcome the fact that the Russians today are talking about humanitarian corridors, but they say they've got to be free humanitarian corridors and that people must not be coerced to leave. And of course, if the UN are not involved in these humanitarian corridors, as they are not and as they are proposed, then what guarantee do the people who are trapped have when they come out, let alone the rebels themselves?
And one of the rebel groups operating in Aleppo is Jabhat al-Nusra, traditionally allied to al-Qaeda. This evening, their leader made a very rare statement. What did that say?
Well, the leader said that they were leaving al-Qaeda, and he made it very clear why. He made no bones about it. He said it was because they were trying to avoid airstrikes by the Americans and the Russians, because the Americans and the Russians are talking about getting together to combat Jabhat al-Nusra. So they are changing their name. They're calling themselves the Levant Conquering Front. And although it might on the surface appear a good thing for a group to split itself from what we used to know as al-Qaeda, the problem for the Americans is that the Nusra fighters could embed themselves with the groups that the Americans support. And therefore, you then have a much wider Islamist front, which the Americans have far less influence over and which they cannot support through Congress because of the involvement of people they regard as terrorists.
Jonathan, thank you very much.